4 true Reddit stories from night shift workers. There's a different kind of energy that takes over the world after midnight, isn't there? For most of us, it's a time to rest and dream. But for some people, it's when their day is just getting started. They're the night shift workers, the ones keeping watch over empty offices and quiet highways. They see things the rest of us don't. They hear sounds that only come out in the pitch black dark. And sometimes, what they run into in those lonely hours before sunrise is enough to make you think twice about ever turning the lights off again. The internet is crawling with stories from people who've seen the unnerving side of working while the rest of the world is asleep. And these aren't just your typical campfire tales. They're real experiences that happened in places you probably pass every day a drive through. A gas station, a hospital. We've gone through Reddit and pulled 4 of the most unsettling true stories from night shift workers. From a bizarre Drew order that made no sense to a terrifying sight in a locked hospital wing, these accounts show you just how isolated and vulnerable you can be on the graveyard shift. Story 1. The screaming in the drive-thru. Our first story is from a 19-year-old college student who was working the summer night shift at a McDonald's drive-thru. It was a pretty standard gig to help pay for tuition, just a monotonous loop of taking orders and handing out food in the middle of the night. Most shifts were quiet, with maybe a long-haul trucker or a few late-night partiers stopping by. But one customer changed all of that. It started when a woman pulled up to the order speaker. Before the employee could even get a word out, they heard her screaming. It was this furious, full-on yelling, aimed at someone she seemed to think was right there in the car with her. The employee, who was a psychology major, felt their stomachs sink. They immediately assumed the worst, that there was a kid in the backseat getting the brunt of this rage. The woman ordered 3 Big Macs and 3 large Cokes. When she pulled around to the window, the employee braced themselves and looked inside her car. It was completely empty. She was all alone. It was weird, but they tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was on a hands-free call. This woman became a regular. Every single night, she'd pull into the drive-thru, and every single night, she'd be in the middle of a screaming match with her invisible passenger. The other employees all knew about her. She was the unnerving fixture of their shift. But for our storyteller, curiosity and concern started to build. They felt like they had to know what was going on. So one Friday, they came up with a simple plan. They pretend they thought she was talking to them and gently ask who she was speaking to. That night, she pulled up, yelling like always. The employee listened closely and heard her scream a name, Darien. Taking a deep breath, they keyed the mic. After the woman placed her order, the employee asked, "Excuse me, will Darien be ordering anything tonight?" Dead silence. The angry rant just stopped. For what felt like forever, there was only static coming from the speaker. The employee asked if she was still there. And that's when it happened. A scream blasted through the intercom. It was a sound so loud and full of raw pain that it physically hurt their ears. It wasn't anger anymore. This was pure, unfiltered terror. It went on for about 30 seconds, this guttural, almost inhuman wail that seemed to shake the whole building. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The car's tires screeched as it peeled out and vanished into the night. The woman never came back. The encounter was so terrifyingly strange that the employee never forgot it. The intercom was actually damaged from the force of her scream. A physical reminder of the night, the silence was shattered by an unexplainable horror. Working alone in a fast food joint is creepy enough, but some jobs put you in a place where life and death are always around the corner. Our next story comes from a nurse on the night shift in a hospital that already had a dark reputation. Story 2. The man with the bag on his head. Hospitals at night have a whole different vibe. The daytime chaos is gone, replaced by a deep, echoing quiet that's only broken by the hum of machines and the soft footsteps of the few people on duty. This story comes from a nurse who was working with a colleague when a patient became extremely agitated around 2 in the morning. The patient was screaming, just absolutely terrified. When the nurses ran into her room, she was pointing at the foot of her bed, yelling about a man with a bag over his head who was just standing there, watching her. The nurses did their best to calm her down, reassuring her no one was there, but the feeling in the room was off. You could feel this sense of dread just hanging in the air. After they got the patient settled, the 2 nurses stepped back into the hallway. And that's when they both saw it at the exact same time. A shadowy figure moving fast through a set of double doors down the hall. It was just a quick glimpse of a dark shape before it disappeared from view. A few seconds passed before the truly chilling reality of what they'd just seen clicked. Those double doors were always locked. You needed a special key to get through them. The time it would take for someone to unlock the doors, walk through, and lock them again from the other side made what they just saw pretty much impossible. They just stood there frozen, the patient's screams about a man with a bag over his head suddenly making a terrifying new kind of sense. They realized this wasn't just a patient's hallucination. They had seen something that shouldn't have been there, something that could move through locked doors like they were made of mist. They walked back to the nurse's station, completely rattled, spending the rest of their shift on edge. The hospital always had its ghost stories, but that night, for those 2 nurses, the stories became way too real. But sometimes, the thing to fear isn't a ghost. It's the very real danger that can walk right in the door. The night shift can leave you exposed to human threats too. Our next story takes us to the isolated counter of a late-night gas station. Story 3. The customer who never left working the graveyard shift at a gas station usually means you're the only employee for miles around. It's a job that forces you to be constantly aware, because you really never know who's going to walk through that door. This story is from an attendant who learned that lesson the hard way. The night was quiet and the weather was bad, which normally meant fewer customers. An early customer had come in acting weird and had made the attendant uneasy, but he eventually left. Or at least, that's what the attendant thought. A while later, when the store was empty, the power suddenly went out, throwing the entire gas station into darkness. In the creepy silence that followed, the attendant heard a noise. They knew right then they weren't alone. As they stepped out from behind the counter, a voice cut through the darkness, stopping them cold. It was the second customer, the one who was supposed to have left. He hadn't. He'd been hiding in the store, just waiting. "Come on, give me what you got now," he said, his voice calm. In that exact moment, the attendant's phone lit up with a call from their manager, and the screen briefly lit up the man's face. They recognized him instantly. He'd been lurking, and now he was making his move. Frozen with fear, the attendant knew there was no way to fight back. This wasn't a movie. Help was at least 30 minutes away, which felt like a lifetime in that situation. They told the robber all they had was the cash in the register, about $250. After a tense moment, the man agreed. The attendant handed over the money, and the robber slipped back into the night as quickly as he'd appeared. They were left shaken, the whole thing a brutal reminder of just how vulnerable you are working alone at night. The story does have a satisfying ending, though. 2 weeks later, the same man was caught trying to rob another gas station nearby. This time, he didn't get away. The experience taught the worker a hard lesson. No matter how normal a night feels, you always have to be on guard, because danger can be waiting just out of sight. Have you ever walked into an empty building and just got a bad feeling? Like the silence itself is somehow too loud? Our final story comes from a security guard whose job was to watch over a huge, vacant building and who discovered that empty doesn't always mean you're alone. Story 4. The Thing in the Doorway. Being a security guard on the third shift in a closed, empty building is pretty much the definition of an isolating job. Our final storyteller was in charge of patrolling a massive, decommissioned brewery. The property had two main buildings, the brewery itself, and a bar about 200 feet away where the guard set up their post for the night. From his very first week, the guard knew something felt wrong. It was more than just the normal unease of being alone in a huge, dark place. The lights in the bar were motion activated. One night, after making his rounds in the main building, he walked back into the bar. As he took a few steps inside, the lights flickered on, just like they were supposed to, and then he froze. Standing in the doorway of a back room was a figure. It was shaped like a person, but it was all wrong. Its arms were way too long, just hanging at its sides, and long hair covered its entire upper body. It was so tall that it had to stoop to fit in the doorway. He just stared, completely paralyzed by shock and terror. The sight was so impossible, his brain couldn't really process it. He blinked, and in that instant, it was gone. The doorway was empty. The silence of the bar rushed back in, but now it felt heavier, more threatening. Shaken, he started asking the day shift crew about it. He was careful with how he worded things, not wanting to sound like he was crazy, but a few of the older guys knew exactly what he was talking about. They'd seen it too, but most of them flat out refused to talk about him. Over the next few weeks, the guard had a few more encounters with the creature, but always inside the bar. He started to think, or maybe just hope, that whatever it was stuck in that one building. That hope was shattered one night as he was leaving. To get out, he had to scan his card, which opened an outer door and then an inner door, creating a little airlock space. He usually waited in this space for the heavy outer door closed behind him. But on this night, as the inner door slid shut, he happened to glance at the reflection in the glass of the outer door as it closed, and he saw it. The thing was standing right behind him, towering over him, its long arms hanging limp. It wasn't stuck in the bar anymore. It could get outside. From that night on, he never waited in the airlock again. He'd sprint inside, flick on all the lights, and only then would he turn back to watch the door seal shut, wondering what was watching him from the darkness. The night is full of stories, and these are just a few of them. What they all prove is that there's a whole different world out there that most of us are lucky enough to sleep through. Now we want to hear from you. What's the creepiest thing you've ever experienced in the dead of night? Drop your story in the comments below. And if you enjoyed these and want more tailies that'll make you check the locks, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe. So, whether it's a screen that can physically break an intercom or a shadowy figure that slips through locked doors, the experiences of night shift workers are a chilling reminder that we're not always as alone as we think we are. The darkness holds its secrets, and for those who have to work in it, sleep might not be the only thing they end up losing. Stay safe, and remember to check the locks. You never know who or what might be on the other side. Title: 6 True Reddit Stories from Night Shift Workers. The world really does change when the sun goes down, doesn't it? For most of us, it's time to rest, wind down, and get some sleep. But for a select few, the night is when their day is just getting started. They're the skeleton crew, the solitary guardians of otherwise silent places, the night shift workers. They see a side of the world that the rest of us never do. The empty offices, the deserted highways, the quiet factories. And sometimes, in that deep, profound quiet, they run into things that just can't be explained. Things that are unsettling, dangerous, and deeply, deeply strange. These are the stories of those who work while the world sleeps, pulled from the deepest corners of Reddit. These aren't your typical ghost stories, but real chilling encounters that show just how vulnerable you can be working the graveyard shift. Our first story comes from a college student who, like many, took a late shift job at a fast food drive-thru to make ends meet. It was her first week, and the nights had been a predictable blur of tired commuters and the odd drunk customer. But one night, that monotony was completely shattered. A car pulled up to her window, and from inside, she heard the raw, frantic sound of a woman screaming. It wasn't just anger. It was a desperate, terrified sound that made the hairs on her arms stand right up. The screaming was aimed at someone in the back seat. The worker leaned closer to the speaker, trying to make out the words through the static. The woman was just yelling, "Stop it. Just stop it," over and over. The employee's first thought? A child was in danger. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she tried to peer into the car's dark interior. But the windows were tinted, and the back seat was just a mess of shadows. She couldn't see anyone else in the car, only the silhouette of the frantic driver. Her voice trembling, she asked the woman for her order. The driver completely ignored her, just continuing her tirade at the passenger no one could see. A cold dread washed over the young worker. She was totally alone, separated from whatever was happening by just a pane of glass. Was she witnessing a kidnapping? An assault? She felt paralyzed, completely helpless. After what felt like forever, the car sped off without even placing an order, leaving the employee shaken and staring out into the empty night. The incident was so disturbing it actually led to the store hiring a security guard for the night shifts, a silent admission of the terrors that can hide in the mundane glow of a drive-through sign. Next up, we have a story from a guy working the graveyard shift at a remote gas station, miles from the nearest town. In these quiet, isolated spots, a night can feel like it stretches on forever, and every customer is a wild card. One evening, a man came in, browsed for a bit, and then left without buying a thing. The worker didn't think much of it. It happened all the time. But about an hour later, the same man came back. This time, his whole vibe was different. He walked straight to the counter, his movements calm, deliberate. He looked the clerk right in the eye, and a quiet, almost conversational tone told him to open the register. The worker froze, his mind scrambling to catch up. And then he saw it, the glint of metal in the man's hand. It was a gun. The robber calmly demanded all the cash. Fear, cold and sharp, cut through the worker's shock. He did as he was told, his hands shaking as he emptied the register. He had no idea if this person was just there for the money, or if he had something much more violent in mind. The robber took the money and left just as quietly as he'd come in, disappearing back into the rural darkness. The employee was left in the ringing silence, his sense of safety completely shattered. Weeks later, a suspect matching the description was caught while trying to rob another nearby convenience store, which was a small comfort for the trauma of that night, which still lingered. Our third story comes from a security guard named Frank, who had the job of watching over a massive, mostly abandoned factory on the outskirts of Detroit. The place was a relic of a dead industrial era, a maze of silent machinery and huge, empty halls. Most nights were crushingly boring, just a routine of patrols and watching grainy footage on a bank of monitors. But one night, something broke that monotony. Frank was scanning the cameras when he noticed movement near a loading dock. It was a shadowy figure, right at the edge of the camera's view. He tried to zoom in, but the image was too distorted to make anything out. His training kicked in. He grabbed his heavy-duty flashlight and went to check it out, his footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space. He checked the loading dock door. It was secure. He swept his light across the whole area, but found no footprints, no sign of a forced entry, nothing out of place at all. He chalked it up to a trick of the light, or maybe a stray animal, and headed back to the security office. But as he sat back down, his eyes were drawn to the monitor again. The shadow was back. It moved with this weird, unnatural fluidity, a dark shape against the gray concrete. Frank's blood ran cold. He watched, frozen, as the figure lingered for a moment before just melting back into the darkness. He spent the rest of his shift completely on edge, jumping at every creak and groan of the old building. He never saw the figure again, and he never got an explanation for what it was. That night left a permanent mark, a constant reminder that even when you think you're totally alone, you might be dead wrong. Working the front desk of a low-budget motel at night is a job that brings in all kinds of people. Our fourth story is from a night clerk who learned this the hard way. It was a Tuesday, usually one of the quietest nights. A man stumbled into the lobby, clearly agitated and probably high on something. He walked up to the desk and started demanding to be let into a locked, staff-only area behind the counter. The clerk, a young woman named Sarah, tried her best to de-escalate, calmly explaining that the area was off-limits. But the man just got more and more aggressive. He started shouting, his voice echoing in the tiny, empty lobby. Then, he started banging his fists on the protective glass between them. The barrier shuddered with every hit, and she was terrified it might actually shatter. Her heart was pounding as she fumbled for the phone under the desk, her fingers slipping on the buttons as she dialed 911. She whispered her location to the dispatcher, trying to keep her voice steady while the man continued his violent outburst. Just as he started trying to pry the glass partition from its frame, the wail of sirens grew louder. The flashing lights of a police car swept across the lobby, and the man, seeing them, finally backed off. The police got there just in the nick of time, arresting him before he could break through. The motel owner, completely shaken, immediately upgraded the security and put a strict new policy in place. No one was ever to work the night shift alone again. These stories are a pretty stark reminder of the hidden dangers that people who work after dark have to face. They're isolated, often outnumbered, and forced to deal with the unpredictable side of a world that operates in the shadows. We've got 2 more stories for you tonight, and each one gets a little more unsettling. But first, if you've had a creepy or unexplainable experience while working the night shift, we'd love to hear about it in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these true tales, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Can you imagine being the only person in a huge, brand new multi-story office building? That was the reality for an employee named Mark, who often stayed late to wrap up projects. The building was a modern marvel of glass and steel, but at night, it completely transformed. The long, empty corridors seemed to stretch on forever, and the silence was so deep, it almost felt like a physical thing. One night, Mark started noticing weird stuff. The lights in a distant section of the floor would flicker on and off, even though he knew nobody was over there. He would feel these sudden, unexplainable drops in temperature, a cold draft in a room with no open windows. He tried to rationalize it all away faulty wiring, the building's new HE system settling in, but the feeling of being watched was a lot harder to dismiss. He'd be typing at his desk and get this distinct sensation that someone was standing right behind him, looking over his shoulder. He'd spin around in his chair, only to find a vast, empty office staring back at him. The mix of isolation and creeping paranoia started to wear him down. After one particularly unnerving night, where he heard what sounded like faint whispering from an empty conference room, he finally went to his manager. He explained the psychological toll of being so utterly alone in such a massive space. To his relief, the company actually took him seriously. They reviewed their safety policies and decided the potential psychological impact and vulnerability just weren't worth the risk. A new rule was made. No employee was to work in the building alone overnight, making sure that the heavy silence at the empty office would never again be shouldered by just one person. Our final story is from a support worker at a group home for adults with developmental disabilities. Being the only staff member on duty overnight is an immense weight of responsibility. While the residents were usually asleep, the potential for a crisis was always there. The silence of the house wasn't peaceful. It was charged with a tense, fragile quiet. One night, the worker was doing her rounds when she heard a floorboard creak in the hallway. She found one of the residents, a man prone to agitation, standing by the front door, fully dressed and determined to leave. He was convinced he had an urgent appointment to get to. The worker knew she had to handle this with extreme care and firmness. The resident was much larger than her, and if he got aggressive, she would be completely on her own. She spoke to him in a low, calming voice, gently trying to redirect his focus and coax him back to his room. For several long, tense minutes, he stood his ground, his agitation growing. The worker's mind raced, planning her next move if things escalated. She had to keep him safe and every other resident in the home, all while being the only one awake. After a long, patient conversation, she finally managed to soothe him and guide him back to his bed. The incident, while it ended peacefully, was a jarring reminder of her vulnerability. It was a night where nothing violent actually happened, yet the potential for danger was a constant, unseen presence, making the quiet hours of her shift the most stressful of all. From a screaming woman in a drive-thru to a shadowy figure in an abandoned factory, these stories pull back the curtain on a side of the night most of us are lucky enough to never see. They really highlight the deep vulnerability and psychological stress that can come with working the graveyard shift. The world doesn't just go to sleep when it gets dark. It just becomes a different, more unpredictable place. So the next time you see the lights on in a lone gas station or a quiet office building late at night, think about the person inside. They're the silent watchers, the guardians of the night, and sometimes they have stories that are way more terrifying than any fiction.